Hello, my name is Bob Tribe, and welcome to Valley to Vietnam. I will be your host. Valley to Vietnam is a joint effort between the Sacramento Public Library and the Vietnam Veterans of America, Sacramento Valley's Chapter 500. It is our intent to trace the arc of experience between Sacramento and Vietnam for our local Vietnam-era veterans. Today, our guest is Frank Rogers, and Frank was a MACV advisor in Vietnam for one tour. So thank you, sir, for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me.
And Frank is just someone I happen to have known now for 55 years. We met when we were 14 years old. So we've been around the block together. Okay, Frank, why don't we start by you talking a little bit about where you were born?
Okay. I was born in Budapest, Hungary, and it was during the war. My parents, of course, were living in Hungary. My grandfather was a minister of agriculture in Hungary, and we lived there during the war. The Russians attacked Budapest, and
at the conclusion of the war.
At the conclusion of the war, and we decided to leave because the Russians would probably take most of the government people and either kill them or send them to Siberia.
Tell us about that exodus that you made with your family.
Yeah, well, I don't remember it, but
of course.
Like I was only 2, but my mom, of course, has told the story many times. My grandfather, my grandmother, and my mother loaded up their pockets and of their coats and jackets with as much jewelry as they could get into it, and we took off for Vienna, which was 180 kilometers away, walking, and they had a little wagon that they carried me in, and so we made it to Vienna, and from there went to Germany.
You basically, I think you'd mentioned to me earlier that they were trading the jewelry not only for safe passage where they would be stopped by various soldiers or ruffians, but also to barter for food.
Right, food and milk, and I'm a 2-year-old. I still got to eat every day.
Yeah.
not like a old person.
And your father was in the Hungarian army.
Yes, he was drafted just like everybody was conscripted in those days, and he ended up in the Cavalry. They got separated during the war, and then after the war, my mother found a job with the Red Cross because she was an interpreter. She could speak several languages, so she found a job with the Red Cross. And a military governor in Germany needed a person that could speak Czech because he had a lot of Czech refugees, and they had a whole Czech refugee camp, and he needed a interpreter. So my mom was sent over, and it turns out that she and he, ended up with a relationship, and he became my stepfather. And
we probably should mention that your father, as part of the Hungarian army, was forced into the German army.
Yes.
And fought on the Russian front, and for a long time you folks had no contact with him.
Right. I didn't even know he was alive until I was 30.
And then he came back after the war and saw your mom, and they decided they were going to get divorced.
Yes.
I just adding this since your mother wasn't a bigamist.
Oh no, that's true. I thank you for bringing that part in. But even at that time, I didn't know about it because I was so young. I don't remember it, and my mother never told me this story until I was 30 years old.
Well, I knew.
So that's how she met my stepfather, and then when the occupation of Germany was over in 1949, we moved to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, where he was originally from. We were there for a couple of years. He went to work for Bankers Life of Iowa, which is a life insurance company, and they first sent him to Billings, Montana for a couple of years. Then we went to Salt Lake City for a couple of years, and then came to Sacramento in 1954.
Where did you live in Sacramento?
Well, Arden Park was the first place we bought. Well, actually, both my parents' homes when I was growing up were in Arden Park. It was on Berendo Drive, right about 4 doors from Marymount School, where I was going to school. And I tell my kids about how I had to walk to school every day in rain or snow or sleet, and it was only 4 doors. And very upset when I showed it to them, and they gave me a bad time for it was only 4 doors away.
And I should mention, for people who don't know where Arden Park is, it's in what's often used to be called the north area. It's actually kind of northeast of Sacramento. Arden Way and Watt, Arden Way and Eastern, that area. Yeah.
Off of Cottage, yeah.
So you went to Marymount School, then you went to Arden for middle school.
Middle school, right.
And then we met at El Camino High School our freshman year.
Correct.
Yeah. So what do you remember about growing up in Sacramento?
Well, as you know, because we could sit here and talk about the great times we had
won't
for a
tell
long time,
some-
but we're not going to get into
Yeah, we
that.
won't tell those stories.
What I liked most about Sacramento was that it was really kind of a carefree time. We really didn't have any real worries. I mean, about the
Yeah.
only thing we had to worry about was getting good enough grades so our parents wouldn't ground us. Other than that,
Sure.
we you know, your homes were never locked. You could ride your bicycle anywhere. Our parents were never worried about us being kidnapped or anything. It was just really, really a carefree time, and we had a lot of fun. We'd ride our bikes everywhere before we drove. I remember riding out to Folsom, out to the old bridge that went across the river there. We jumped off the old bridge and,
Right.
and broke into the abandoned PG&E substation there, and we rode to Roseville and Citrus Heights, and we rode bicycles everywhere in those days. And we just had a really good time.
BB gun fights in the hop
BB gun,
fields.
yeah, BB gun fights
Yeah.
in the old Severn hop fields.
Yeah, the hop fields extended from the other side of Sac State for miles.
Right. Down
Yeah.
where my parents ended up living in Wilhagen, which is off
Sure.
of Rio
Which was the
Americana
old hop
Drive,
fields.
or American River Drive.
Yeah.
And that's where the barley and hop fields were down
Yeah,
there.
basically between Folsom Boulevard and Fair Oaks Boulevard, all the way out was just hop fields. So that was
That's
kinda
where we had our
interesting.
BB gun fights.
Carefree is a word that I hear over and over again when people talk about growing up in, in our era, and that's true. It was just real carefree. Occasionally, we'd have to practice, getting under our desks if there was a nuclear attack. I don't
Yes.
think that would have helped us much.
Not much.
But we didn't take it too seriously, so we weren't worried about it.
No, and I don't remember knowing anybody that had a bomb shelter.
From graduation from high school in 1961, you headed to New Mexico Military Institute.
Correct, yeah.
Tell us about that.
I went down there for 2 years, partially because I kind of had an idea I might want to go to the Air Force Academy.
Uh-huh.
And while I was there at the New Mexico Military Institute, I decided I didn't want to spend another 4 years of military school, so I didn't end up at the Air Force Academy. But New Mexico Military Institute was cool. There was a couple other Sacramentans that were there with me, Bud Applegate, Wayne Lockwood, and
Mike Clancy.
then later Mike Clancy.
Yeah.
So those are the only Sacramento guys I remember that went there. But I don't know if we were bad boys. I don't think we were sent there for being bad boys, but
No, I mean, there were several guys who, from El Camino, who didn't go to Roswell, but they went to there was a military institute over in Marin County, and I know several guys got sent there.
yeah.
And it probably paid off if you're going to go
It paid
into the
off in the long
service.
run. I mean, it paid off in
Yeah.
the long run. I mean, who knows at that time, it was 1961, nobody thinking about Vietnam at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't even spell it then.
Plus, when you went in the Army versus when I went in, it was like going to another planet. But for you, it was all that stuff you already knew, and you
Yeah.
probably excelled at and were made a leader right away.
Yeah,
so.
well, I already knew how to march.
Yeah, I didn't.
I taught people how to march right away. I was kind of like the platoon leader from the very beginning because I already knew what I was doing. So the military was real easy for me because I already done
Yeah.
it for 2 years.
After Roswell, you went where the UFOs landed in June 8th of 1947, I might add, which is when my
By the way,
wife-
nobody ever mentioned the
That's
UFOs in Roswell while we were there. There was no tourist deal like it is now. I didn't even know about
My wife
aliens in Roswell until years and years and later, and all of a sudden they're making a big deal about it. But they weren't even talking about it in the 60s.
My wife was born on that date, and we always kind of kid her that she might be from another planet. But so after that, you head to University of Nebraska.
Right. I went to the University of Nebraska again because my dad and his family all went there.
Uh-huh.
And I had cousins there, and I'd worked on a ranch of one of my cousins, and he was a Sigma Chi at Nebraska, and his buddies would come through town, and they kind of talked me into going there, and I loved it. It was a great place to be a Californian.
Did you start thinking after you graduated from Nebraska in June of '65 that you just might be drafted?
Absolutely, because I was 1A. Once you're out of school, you no longer have the student deferment. So I knew I was going to be drafted. My mother helped me get a job with the state legislature. She was active in the Republican Central Committee in those days, so she got me a job with the Assembly Sergeant at Arms. Tony Beard was the
Oh, sure.
Sergeant at Arms at that time, and I think his son is now the Sergeant at Arms of the State Senate.
Yeah, and you worked with some very prominent freshman
Oh,
legislators.
Willie
like-
Brown was a freshman. John Burton was a freshman at the time.
Yeah.
So they were probably 27, 28, and I was 21, 22. So
Big Daddy was probably
Big
around.
Daddy was still, Big Daddy Unruh, Jesse Unruh was still Speaker of the House. And he just lost like 100 pounds over from one session to the other, and nobody recognized him because he was a whole different guy. But he sure
Right.
wielded some power.
He was a powerful guy.
I got drafted in December '65 and was sent to Fort Lewis, Washington for basic training in AIT,
Near Tacoma.
up by Tacoma, right?
Yeah. And so that must have been a whiz for you, since you had
Yeah,
all that military stuff.
Yeah, I got Soldier of the Week, Soldier of the Month all the time. I maxed all the tests whenever they gave them to us, and so it was pretty easy.
Now that was a little different, basic and AIT. Most of us went to a training center and got, went through basic training in AIT and then got sent maybe to a unit after that. But
Right,
you actually were training with the 4th Infantry Division.
Correct.
The whole division was going to go to Vietnam.
Exactly. Each unit was responsible for training their own new trainees.
Right.
And this was, so we were going to have 2 months of basic training, 2 months of AIT, and another 2 months of training past that, and then we were going as a whole division to Vietnam. And I didn't want to do that because I decided I didn't want to be an enlisted man in an infantry division.
Good decision.
Yeah, as it turned out, because I know for a fact that the company I was with, most of them got wiped out. So I applied for OCS, and you have to take an exam, as you
Right.
know, and of course I passed it. And so I applied for Armor OCS because I didn't want to walk. I wanted to ride.
And you thought that maybe steel was better than just your
Than a
uniform
field jacket.
to protect
Exactly.
you.
That was
yeah.
that was a saying in the Armor. It's much better than a field jacket.
That's true. And that's at Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Right. Correct.
Yeah. That's close to there is the home of the 101st Airborne, I think.
That's Fort Campbell. I think
Yeah.
it's at the other end of Kentucky.
Okay.
Kentucky's long and skinny like
Long and
Tennessee,
skinny,
so
right.
yeah, Fort Campbell's up.
So you
east
came out
there.
of OCS when then?
I went in May of '66, and I graduated in November of '66.
Most new lieutenants do is they get so much command time before they're sent to Vietnam because they want them to get comfortable with being an officer and leading troops and all that sort of thing.
And the other thing they did is they also sent a lot of graduates to training camp,
Company
training
commanders.
officers,
Yeah.
and have to get up at 4:30 in the morning to get the troops up at 5, and you go
Right.
to bed at midnight after you put them to bed. And I didn't want that job either.
Yeah, that happened to most of my friends
Yeah.
after OCS. Yeah.
So my father, since he'd been in the Army, he had some old Army friends, and one of them happened to be the commanding general of the 6th Army, which is California, West Coast.
Presidio.
And
That'd be nice
well,
to
he
get.
couldn't get me into the
Yeah.
Presidio, but he got me into Fort Irwin, California, which
Oh,
is
that's
the
the-
Desert Training Center, which was just perfect for Vietnam.
That's the opposite of the Presidio.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's down in the California desert.
Yes.
It's hotter than hell.
Yeah, 35 miles due north of Barstow, and the southern
wow.
border of Fort Irwin is the northern. The northern border of Fort Irwin is the southern border of Death Valley.
Right.
So it's a nice place.
And isn't that where Patton trained his troops back
Yeah,
before World War II
it was
or
always
something?
a desert warning.
Yeah.
It still is
Yeah.
a desert training center now. The 11th Cav is there now.
Okay, what other schools did you attend before you went to Vietnam?
Well, what happened? I became a company commander of the U.S. Army garrison down there, which is it's made up of all of the workers for the post itself. Everybody that operated everything, filling. So I decided to volunteer for Vietnam, and the Armor office, the Armor Personnel Office, wrote me back. In those days we didn't have cell phones and email and all that, so it was all by snail mail. And they wrote me back and said, "Well, if you want to go, we'll have to. We could get you to go right away as a public information officer, and then once you get to Vietnam, you could probably." Volunteer for combat duty, and because they'd need you. So that's what I did, and they sent me to the Defense Information School in Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana. Then I went to, since I wanted to be a Vietnamese advisor, I got orders to go to the Vietnamese language school, and they couldn't send me to Monterey because it was full.
Oh.
So they sent me to the Navy one down in Coronado, and that was fabulous. It was great being an Army officer in a Navy town.
Well, just being in Coronado is great, no matter what. Okay, so you're sent to Vietnam in what, September of '67?
Correct.
In fact, I saw you off. I went.
You know,
Yeah.
you might have,
took
I
you
can't
to-
remember. It's been
yeah,
so
I
long ago.
took you to Oakland. I was home on leave. I took you to the Oakland Army Depot, which is where you were kind of grouped. And here were a bunch of guys from
Yep.
my old OCS. The first of the guys from my class who were going to Vietnam left in September of
Yeah,
'67
okay.
too.
And then they put us on the bus to Travis.
Yeah,
And
so we all had lunch together, and then you got on the bus, and I said, "Good luck."
yeah.
So your initial assignment in Vietnam
Was as a public information officer.
Oh,
And when I got there, I didn't want to do that job. I wanted to go to combat. So I went to the commander and said, you know, I'd rather do this. And they said, well, I've got an opening in 6th Armored Cavalry, but not until one of the other gentlemen that was going to leave. He had 90 more days. So he said, I'll put you into be the advisor for the 7th ARVN Division Reconnaissance Platoon.
okay.
So here I am being infantry, the one thing I didn't want to do.
It's a fine branch, son.
It's a fine branch, and I
Yeah.
think very highly of all you guys.
You do that for what, a couple, 2-3 months?
A little over 2 months, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then you get your chance to be in a armored cav unit.
right.
So now you're in APCs, Armored
Yeah,
Personnel
Armored Personnel
Carriers.
Carriers, right.
And I should mention that for those who don't know, that South Vietnam at that time was divided into 4 corps. So you had I Corps, which was up against the DMZ. You had 2 Corps, which was mostly Central Highlands. You had 3 Corps, which was centered around Saigon, and then you had the
Benoit.
Mekong Delta and all the rice paddies.
Right,
down
that
in-
was 4 Corps, right. That's
that
where I
4
was,
Corps, yeah.
down
Okay.
in the rice paddies.
And you were near Mito.
Mito was the name of the town. It was a province capital. And the province was probably the size of about a county, you know, about the same size as a county here.
Uh-huh.
No mountains,
Right.
no hills. You couldn't dig a foxhole because you'd hit water in 6 inches.
So how did you, suddenly you're sort of in charge of a lot of Vietnamese troops. How was your connection with them? How well did that work?
Well, it was really great. You know, it was hard to speak to them at first because, you know, language school was only 3 months, and you don't really learn the language that well. So it was hard to speak to them at first, but it was kind of cool because they wanted to learn English. So they were trying to speak English, and I was trying to speak Vietnamese, so we got along just fine. So it was a culture shock for me too, because growing up in Sacramento, I don't even remember going to a Chinese restaurant when I was a kid. My parents never went to Chinese restaurants, so I had no Asian food. I didn't know how to work chopsticks. I didn't know anything. And the first day I show up with my new counterparts, is they gave me my own chopsticks and my own ceramic bowl and my own soup spoon, the ceramic soup spoon.
Sure.
So that's it. You got to carry that with you every day. That's what you eat out of every day. Well, I couldn't work the darn things for a while, but I finally figured it out, of course. And I ended up loving Asian food because of the Vietnamese food I ate
And that's
on
amazing
a
to
daily
me.
basis.
I mean, I was out in the field all the time, always was eating sea rations.
I never
you said
saw
you
one.
never saw one.
Never saw one.
That to me is amazing.
Well, but that's one of the nice things about being an advisor, is that you were living off the land and whatever they ate. And when we were off duty and I went back to our own base camp, there wasn't sea rations. It was like any base camp. It had, we had steaks and regular American food.
Right. Now, the cavalry is divided into different units than the infantry. The infantry, we have squads, platoons, companies, battalions, but
Right.
you have
Well, troops. There's a troop. Was 12 armored personnel carriers, and there were 10 people on each armored personnel carrier.
wow.
So you had 120 people in one troop, and there's 3 troops in the squadron. And the 6th
Okay.
Armored Cavalry Squadron was 3 troops.
and you folks rotated, you said, duty. The
Yeah.
3 troops did.
Yeah. You'd spend 30 days in town of Mito and would be town security. And actually what that meant is that we could hang out at our base camp and not have, we just have to be on call really if anything happened, and it did every once in a while. Then you had 30 days out on Highway 4, which was road security, because we had to open up the road every morning to look for IEDs and snipers, whatever.
Right.
So you do that for 30 days, and then the other 30 days would be stationed out on Highway 4 in a little small base camp, and you would be mobile strike force. So if anybody got in trouble and they needed us, we could get there pretty quickly.
Yeah.
We could get to anywhere in just about an hour.
Tell me a little bit about TET. TET was February of '68.
February '68.
Where everything goes crazy
Yes.
across the whole country.
Yeah,
so.
we happened to be in town at that time, and it was the largest holiday in the Vietnamese culture. It's like putting Christmas and New Year's and Easter and everything together in one big event. It's actually the New Year. It's attached to the New Year. It's not Chinese New Year's because it was in Vietnam, but it's an Asian New Year. They use that calendar, and 2/3 of our troops had gone home to celebrate with their families, so they weren't on duty. And then Tet, of course, they attacked practically every provincial capital, and Mito got attacked from the north, and we were there for 4 days. It took 4 days to get the VC out of there, and we were operating with 1/3 strength.
Your troop had 40 men instead of 120.
40 men instead of 120.
Wow.
But we still operated all 12 of the armored personnel carriers because we just had less people on each one of them. So
they had M60s and 50 calibers on those.
Yes.
Okay.
But this was before we had M16s. The Vietnamese didn't have M16s yet.
Now you also had artillery you could call in, and
artillery, Air Force, yeah. We were right next to the 9th Division, which was in Dong Tam, about 7 kilometers away.
Now, how about when you were wounded?
Well, that was later. That was in May. After Tet, we just kept going after, whatever the intelligence told us about where the the VC battalions were, where they were located, and whatever the intelligence told us, we'd go looking for them, and we'd get into firefights often with them because they were trying to, they made a big, big dent in what was going on during the Tet offensive. So the VC and the NVA wanted to keep that momentum going. So the fighting kept going. It wasn't just over at the end of Tet.
Right.
So anyway, we got into a firefight with a VC battalion about 20 kilometers from Mito, and that's when we were on the mobile strike force, and we were called in because one of our recon platoons, which luckily I wasn't with anymore, ran into these guys, and we had to come over and help out. And the fighting went on into the night, which didn't normally happen that often. But so there's a lot of things flying around, and my track got hit by a Russian rocket in the left rear corner, and shrapnel hit me in the back of the head, and next thing I knew, I woke up in a helicopter. And I don't know what time period it was, but it had to have been quite a bit of time because the helicopters couldn't get in right away, so I don't know how long I was out.
And you mentioned that when you were riding on APCs, armored personnel carriers, you didn't typically ride inside.
No, you don't ride inside. You ride on top.
And here's that thing you're saying, you've got that steel between you, but actually if you're on the outside, you don't have a lot of steel to protect yourselves.
No.
And you do that mainly because you don't want to be caught in there when they
fire
an RPG.
No, if a rocket
something.
goes through there, it just kills everybody inside. So they learned that real early.
Yeah. Okay.
And so you ride on. We had shields over, 50 caliber had a shield around it, so you did have some shielding. It wasn't quite the same, but when it hits the backside, I got hit in the back of the head.
Right. And so you were shipped to a hospital where?
In Dong Tam, which is the 9th Division, 9th U.S. Army Division, and they had a evac hospital there, and I was there for a couple weeks.
But you still have some time left, and are you going to go back up to the field, or?
Well, when I got back, and I was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and then I went back to the base camp, and the colonel told me he wants me to lay around for another couple more weeks. They don't, even then, like today, you don't know what a head wound will do, what the ramifications are. So after a couple of weeks, they told me, well, we don't want you to go out in the field again, and we've got an opening in the Tactical Operations Center.
The TOC.
The TOC. And that's where all of anything that goes on goes through there. And we were like a mirror of the 7th ARVN Division Tactical Operations Center. They had one room and we had another room, and we just mirrored whatever they were doing, and because we were supporting them with artillery and Air Force and helicopters and things like that. So we weren't, we were advisors. They were doing the actual fighting, and we were doing the actual advising them, and we were also the main communications with all of the support. So I did that till I came home in September.
September of '68.
Correct.
You came home. And so then you're out of the service at that time?
Yes, I was released because I came home with less than 90 days left. And in those days, if you came home with less than 90 days left, they'd let you out early.
You're thinking about going to grad school, or what are you thinking about doing with your life?
Well, I didn't really want to stay here in Sacramento, not because of Sacramento, but more for family reasons. I thought the Bay Area would be where I wanted to go. So I went down to the Bay Area and got an apartment in Oakland and ran into some old high school friends, Robbie Olson, who also was from Sacramento, El Camino, and they needed a roommate, so I moved in with them, and they just happened to live in this gorgeous 5-bedroom house at the top of Panoramic Drive with a view of the whole Bay Area.
In Berkeley.
In Berkeley.
Yeah.
So I enrolled at Cal State Hayward.
I guess just a few final things. I wonder, you know, how you felt about the service. I always say that if I had it to do all over again, I would. You know, I went in thinking about, geez, I'm throwing away 3 years, and it turned out it was just the opposite. So, I mean, how do you feel about it?
I agree with you. You know, you and I, we knew men that were in the military that fought it every minute they were in it, and
right.
they just you know, and they had miserable times, and they made themselves miserable. I felt that the best way was to adapt, and as you know, humor is a fabulous way to adapt when you're in the military, and I think that's one of the great attributes of most American military is their sense of humor. And I mean, even like, you know, we're saying that when I was in the Tactical Operations Center, you'd be talking to people on the radio all the time. I can't tell you how many times I got cracked up by what guys were telling me, you know, making jokes when they're getting, you know, shot at from all corners, and they're making a joke out of it. I mean,
right.
So if you had a sense of humor in the service and you went with the program, you're going to do fine. If you fight it, you're not going to do fine.
Well, I think that concludes our interview. I just want to say thank you very much for being on Valley to Vietnam, and say welcome home to you and to all our veterans.
Right. Thank you. You know, when we first came home, nobody wanted to talk to us.
I know. That's different than today.
Yeah, it sure is.
For Valley to Vietnam producer Jerry Ward, director James Scott, and researcher Christy Dintry, I'm Bob Tribe saying farewell, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Valley to Vietnam.